Call the Honourable Dr Duncan Webb.
Tēnako, te mana whakawā. Well, here we are, finally getting rid of this divisive and wasteful bill. Now, unlike James Meagher, I'm not going to spend 10 minutes whining about process, but I will say two things. Firstly, there are 105,000 submissions that aren't on the parliamentary record today. And to suggest that that's all okay is false. And there was a room down in the corner with 24 boxes of handwritten, typed submissions, hard copy submissions that you had to go in and rifle through if you wanted to find something. And if you wanted to find a particular submission, you had to name it. You had to name the submitter. And I'm sorry, but I don't know 307,000 people.
Really?
And what's more, whilst that process was still ongoing, the chairman of the Select Committee moved the motion to report the bill back to the House 40 days before it was due, whilst we were still working through the submissions and putting them on the record. That is shabby process, but not as shabby as what the government has done and the Prime Minister has done in letting this bill come to the House. Because this is a bill that the Prime Minister had the gall to stand up and say it's not going to pass, and to then bring it to this House is disrespectful to this chamber. Because this chamber's time is valuable, and there should be put before this House laws which are seriously being considered, not flying up the flagpole some divisive bill. But I do want to pay tribute to those submitters, all of those people. And I must say it was humbling, not only the people who came in person from across the community, but also to read some of those written submissions as well. And I want to pay respect and to the diversity of the views, the people who came and gave their whakapapa and told their stories and expressed their vehement opposition to the bill, not in a way that David Seymour would understand, but in a way that came from a long history. Not a academic tradition that I'm familiar with, but I engaged with it and I learned from it. And the new immigrants who came and said, I'm proud to be here and to participate in this country, and I understand. The treaty helps me understand my place in this community. You know, and I see, David Seymour was already on Twitter saying that he doesn't have a good reason for why this bill is being turned around. Well, I'll give you one. It's a lie. The bill is a lie because it says one thing and the truth is another. It says that these are the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi, and they're not. And as Chris Finlayson said, you can't legislate to make the world flat. The fact is you cannot legislate the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi out of existence. They might be constitutional truisms, or they might be undermining the customary position of iwi in our country, but they're not the treaty principles. You can't make up the underlying fabric of the treaty. So it's absolutely fatuous to suggest that this bill reflected in any way the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi. And I want to address head on two other fallacies which underpin this bill. The first is that his stooges would front up to the committee and say, this is about living in a liberal democracy. And their concept of a liberal democracy was shallow and impoverished, because all it meant was one person, one vote. What it didn't mean was a respect for human rights, a recognition of Indigenous people in the place where they belong. What it didn't recognise was the rights of minorities. So what we had was an argument which was about 100 years out of date. And that's about where they are. And you know, and the irony is this, that in all of the advice that was received, not just submissions, but the thoughtful advice, pointed this out. And even the Cabinet Manual, a document which isn't a political document, makes it really clear that there is a balance to be struck between the rights of the majority power in a place like this, and minority rights, the protection of fundamental social and constitutional values. But the ACT Party's not interested in that. They're interested in a radical individualism which doesn't recognise that there are communities of interest, that there are differences between people, and that in a modern liberal democracy, as Bronwyn Hayward so thoughtfully put, there is a duty to protect those people who are vulnerable, to respect Indigenous rights, and to ensure that the majority does not oppress the minority. So that's what a modern, functioning liberal democracy is. They don't want that, Kieran McAnulty. They want the opposite. They want to go back 100 years and live in a radical libertarian world. The other argument they want, and I want to go head on, and the ACT member on the committee would constantly put to submitters the following question: does the Treaty of Waitangi give different rights based on ancestry? This absolute trope of inequality. Now, the lie in that, the falsehood underlying that statement, is that difference is inequality, and it's not. Now, there are all kinds of ways we can be different. We can have kaupapa Māori health services, or schools, or social services. And in fact, anyone who knows the area will know that you don't even have to be Māori to access them. They're for everyone. But to suggest that to deliver services in a particular way to best serve communities is in some way unequal is an absolute fallacy. And time and again we heard the resource management trope come up. David Seymour himself mentioned it today. Now, we pressed on that because if there's something there we wanted to know, we asked the question, what is it? What is the special advantage that Māori have under the Resource Management Act? No one could put their finger on it. And if it's a special advantage, if it's a special advantage for mana whenua to be asked about a project that might impact their customary rights, well, that's a world I want to live in, because that's actually respecting customary rights and property interests. And you should be respecting that as well. And the suggestion, of course, that Māori are precluded in some way is just false. The provision of services, the fallacy is that the provision of services should be in a non-Māori way. And what that does is essentially exclude the reality that there is more than one way of doing things, that we can do things which are equal and different, and that's not appropriate. So what we have here is a situation where 300,000 people have stood up, and many people at Select Committee spoke up. But over there, they stood by. They stood by and did nothing. And they actually presided over a piece of legislation which has been exceedingly divisive. Now, you can talk about a conversation, and we are prepared for a conversation, and I'm proud to stand with my colleagues, my Māori colleagues who have spoken today here from the Labour Party, from the Greens and from Te Pāti Māori. But to have an ill-thought-out bill based on premises which are fundamentally racist is not having a constitutional conversation. The time may come to talk about how we honour the treaty in a more fulsome way, about how we live together and address some of the gross inequalities which continue in our society. But to put a bill into the House that we know is never going to be passed, so that we can see some of the hateful rhetoric coming out, is simply divisive, wasteful and wrong. So I'm proud to speak today, but proud not for what this House has done, but for what New Zealand has done. It has come out in its thousands and hundreds of thousands to say, we'll have no part of this.
Thank you all very much for watching. This is one in a 15-part series looking at what our members of parliament had to say on the Treaty Principles Bill. I hope through doing this series you'll get an understanding of what our members of parliament thought of the bill, why they supported it, why they opposed it, and ultimately why the bill was voted down.